The courts in Hull in the 19th century were full of petty offenders, just like the criminal justice system today. So the kinds of offenders that we might find in the courts in Hull and Beverley were those people who were committing low-level, everyday offences. So it might be people who were convicted for public disorder offences, for drunkenness, and there was a huge amount of concern about drunkenness in the 19th century, and thousands of people every year were convicted and given short sentences for crimes like drunkenness. And people would find themselves in court in what's the equivalent of our magistrates' court today. They were called police courts or petty sessions courts, and this is where most of the activity of criminal justice occurred. At courts like the Guildhall in Hull, that's where the Quarter Sessions Court was held, and this Quarter Sessions Court dealt with the more serious offences. Even so, we would still find the majority of those offenders were accused of petty thefts and theft-related offences. It was certainly the case that those kinds of offences made up most of the activity of the criminal justice system in the 19th century. But like today, lots of people were concerned about crime, and they were concerned about serious crime. In the 1850s and 1860s, part of this concern also drove the criminal justice system to start collecting information about offenders. So we can see, for example, in some of these images that there are plenty of photographs of offenders. This is because the criminal justice system was starting to try to identify offenders, and particularly to identify repeat or habitual offenders, as they called them. So the police and the prison authorities would collect information about offenders. They would collect a physical description of them, their height, their weight, their complexion, if they had any distinguishing marks like scars or tattoos. And as you can see in this image, offenders are holding up their hands. This is so that the authorities can see whether they have any missing digits and also whether they have any tattoos on their hands. Again, this was about tracing offenders and ensuring that when people were picked up again for a repeat offence, the court system would be aware of that and would punish them adequately. Since the 19th century, we've developed various techniques in order to survey offenders today.
As Helen points out, from the mid-19th century, the police and criminal justice agencies began to use photography and files as a means of identifying and classifying criminals. However, we can trace these techniques in state identification much further back than this. As Valentine Grosvenor points out, as early as the Middle Ages, some 400 or 500 years before the advent of photography, the authorities were using badges to try and identify people. They used this to identify various groups such as servants or foreign beggars. Today, of course, these badges and photography have been placed by networks of millions of surveillance cameras which exist in virtually every town centre and urban area of the UK. This, of course, is no longer just about watching individual deviants or suspects. This is about monitoring whole groups and populations. But the problem of state identification and classification is still there, because CCTV operators obviously sometimes don't know who they're looking at. This is why the technology companies are working on facial recognition systems, so that cameras can be programmed with computer software to automatically identify people that appear on the screen. They can be compared with a pictorial database held in police headquarters. This also reminds us that surveillance is no longer confined to enclosed and controlled settings. It can actually take place from anywhere in the world. We recently conducted some research in Hong Kong on the use of nanny cams to monitor migrant domestic workers. And one of these domestic workers told us that they found out that the images displayed by these hidden nanny cams were actually monitored by the child's grandparents in Canada. Now, some people think Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, kind of anticipated some of these developments. Because in a book about the birth of the prison called Discipline and Punish, Foucault said we shouldn't be surprised if these techniques of surveillance and monitoring and watching that were perfected in the prison would eventually seep out into other areas of society, like the factory or the hospital or even the school. Schools as prisons? Surely this is an exaggeration. However, We did some research a few years ago for the Economic and Social Research Council about people's experience of surveillance, and one of the groups we spoke to were school children. We spoke to 85 school children, and one of the schools we went to, it had a network of 62 surveillance cameras, external cameras, also cameras in the classroom to monitor people that were described as having behavioural issues. The school was completely fenced off. The children had ID cards to get in and out. There was an automated attendance system whereby any pupil that turned up late, even 1 minute late, a text message would be immediately sent to their parents to say your child has not arrived at school today. There was computer monitoring. The children didn't know who was watching them. Was it IT staff? Was it teachers? They weren't quite sure, but they knew they were being watched because they said they can take control of your computer and shut it down when you're on the wrong website. So we spoke to these children in the focus groups, and they said two things to us. Firstly, our school is like a prison. Secondly, they said, why don't adults trust us anymore? So an interesting exercise for you to conduct in your classes would be this. Why, when statistically speaking, schools are one of the safest spaces that you would ever find for a child to spend time in, have they suddenly come to resemble prisons?